The wind off the Absaroka Range didn't arrive with warning. It materialized one moment the air above the high plains was still, and cutting cold the next, it was a living thing, a horizontal force that pressed against the chest and found every gap in every layer of clothing a man owned. Caleb Merritt had lived with this wind for 11 years. He knew its moods the way other men knew the moods of difficult women, not with affection, but with a hard-earned functional respect. He stood on the porch of the main house and watched the western sky turn the color of a bruise. The mountains had been swallowing clouds since noon, pulling them in and compressing them against the granite ridgelines until the white of them went gray. Then the gray went charcoal. Then the charcoal went the particular shade of iron that meant serious snow. Not a dusting, not the polite early-season flurries that skiers paid money to drive 3 hours to stand in. This was the kind of storm that the old-timers in Pinedale described with the same flat reverence they used for funerals. The kind that decided things. Ranger sat beside him, pressed against his left leg, with the quiet constancy of something that had been doing this long enough that it no longer required a decision. The dog was 3 years old and built like he had been designed specifically for this landscape, thick double coat, in shades of silver and dark pewter, broad chest ears that missed nothing. Caleb had driven to a rescue operation in Riverton on a Tuesday in March of 2022 with no particular intention of coming home with a dog, and he had driven home 4 hours later with Ranger riding shotgun, the dog's enormous head tilted toward the heating vent with what appeared to be deliberate satisfaction. They had not needed to negotiate the terms of their arrangement. It had simply been obvious to both of them. Caleb reached down and let the back of his hand rest briefly against the dog's ear. Ranger didn't look up. He was watching the same sky, his nostrils working in slow, methodical pulls, cataloging the approaching weather with instruments Caleb didn't possess. The porch boards were solid under his boots. He had replaced 6 of them in October, working by headlamp on the cold evenings after the ranch chores were finished. Sarah had always said the porch was the best part of the property, the place where the mountains were framed perfectly by the roofline, where you got all of the view and none of the wind. She had been right. She had been right about most things pertaining to this land, which she had understood in the specific, tactile way of someone who had studied the earth professionally and loved it personally. She could look at an outcropping and tell you its age. She could look at a sky and tell you what it was planning. She had looked at this particular piece of Wyoming and told Caleb it was where they were supposed to be, and he had believed her without requiring further explanation. He turned and went back inside before the first flake fell. The kitchen table held the same envelope it had held for 3 days. He had opened it the morning it arrived, read it twice with the particular careful attention he gave to things he needed to fully understand before he allowed himself to react, and then he had placed it face down in the center of the table and gone about his day. This was the 4th letter from the bank in 14 months. The first 3 had carried escalating language past due delinquent final notice, that language bureaucracies used to prepare a man for what was coming without ever quite arriving at it directly. This 4th letter had arrived at it directly. 30 days. The number sat inside him like a stone he'd swallowed, present in every movement, every breath, a weight he had arranged his posture around. The original loan had been taken in 2019 when he and Sarah had bought the land and begun the process of building a life on it with the combination of his military savings, her geologist's salary, and a mortgage that had seemed manageable until it wasn't. The medical bills had come first, then the extended leave from her work, then the period he did not think about directly, the 14 months between diagnosis and the morning in January 2021, when he had sat in the chair beside her hospital bed and held her hand and felt with a terrible and specific clarity the exact moment she was no longer there. He had come back to the ranch because there was nowhere else to go, and because she was in the walls of it, in the porch boards and the window frames, and the angle of the kitchen light in the late afternoon. He had serviced the loan as long as he could with the income from the cattle he ran on the lower pasture, and a small contract he held with a neighboring operation. He had been falling behind for 2 years. The letter on the table was the formal acknowledgement that falling behind had become something else entirely. He poured coffee, stood at the counter, and did not look at the envelope. Ranger's food bowl scraped against the tile floor as the dog nudged it toward the center of the room. Not a demand, more of a gentle administrative reminder. Caleb measured out the kibble, set the bowl down, and watched the dog eat with the efficient focus of an animal that understood mealtimes as one of the day's reliable certainties. He had eaten his own breakfast an hour earlier. Eggs from the 3 hens he kept in the small coop behind the woodshed, toast from a loaf he'd baked on Sunday, coffee that was stronger than most people would consider reasonable. He had learned to cook adequately in the years since Sarah. It was not something he took pride in. It was something he did because the alternative was not eating, and not eating interfered with function. The satellite phone on the wall mount rang at 11:47 in the morning, which he knew because he had just looked at the clock above the stove, a reflex from years of military scheduling that he had never fully shed. Helen Crane's voice carried the particular texture of a woman trying to sound less worried than she was. Helen was 65, had run the Crane property 3 miles down the main road for 40 years, kept a cabin on the north edge of her land that she rented to visitors looking for what the tourism websites called a wilderness experience. She made excellent pie. She had shown up at his door 3 days after Sarah's funeral with an apple pie, and the specific wisdom not to say anything at all, just handing it over and leaving. He had eaten the entire thing that night standing at the counter in the dark, and had felt for the first time in weeks that sustaining his body was a thing worth doing. "I've got renters supposed to be in the north cabin." Her words came with the slight static of a connection that was already feeling the weather. "Checked in yesterday afternoon, or they were supposed to. I called the cabin phone twice, nothing. I'm down in town, the road up is already going." A pause, the crackle of interference. "I have a bad feeling, Caleb. You know I don't call unless I mean it." He did know that. In 11 years, she had called him twice with requests. Once when a fence line on her northern boundary had collapsed into the road and she needed an extra set of hands. Once when she'd found a black bear that had gotten into her shed and couldn't work out how to leave. Both times she had stated the situation, plainly accepted his help without ceremony, and fed him dinner after. He had no framework for declining a third call. "I'll go check it." He was already looking at his jacket on the hook by the door. "Bless you. The emergency kit is under the kitchen sink if they're there and need it. And Caleb," she hesitated, "be careful on Ridgeline Road. It's going to get mean up there." He hung up and looked at Ranger, who had finished eating and was now sitting in the precise center of the kitchen with his ears fully upright, tracking the conversation with the alert attention of someone who understood enough to know that plans had changed. "Load up." The dog was at the door before Caleb had crossed the room. The drive to Helen's north cabin covered 5 miles of increasingly hostile terrain, the last 2 on a logging road that in summer was rough and negotiable, and in the first serious snow of the season became an exercise in reading ground that no longer showed itself clearly. Caleb drove the F250 with the 4-wheel engaged from the moment he turned off the county road, keeping his speed deliberate, his hands relaxed on the wheel, his attention distributed across the windshield and the tree line on both sides. The snow was coming in earnest now, not the fat, slow-motion flakes of a gentle storm, but dense, wind-driven curtains of it that reduced visibility in intervals, opening and closing like a lens. Ranger rode with his head high, fogging the passenger window at irregular intervals, occasionally pressing his nose to the glass when something in the passing woods caught his attention. Caleb drove without the radio. He preferred silence when conditions required reading. Silence was information. The sound of the tires on the surface beneath the snow, the particular pitch of the wind against the cab, the way the truck tracked on a given stretch of road, these things told him what the windshield couldn't. He saw the cabin first as a dark shape in the white, the A-frame roofline, visible through the trees about 30 yards from where the logging road opened into a small clearing. No lights in the windows. The exterior lamp above the door that Helen kept on a timer was dark. Either the power was out or the timer had failed. He pulled the truck to a stop and sat for a moment, engine running, taking inventory of what was in front of him. A rental car was parked to the right of the cabin, or partially parked at the front end, had drifted sideways into the shallow drainage ditch that ran along the clearing's edge, the front passenger tire sitting in a foot of accumulated snow and visibly flattened. The car was a mid-size sedan, the kind rented at regional airports, completely wrong for this road in this weather. The accumulation on the hood told him it had been sitting for several hours at minimum. Ranger made a sound, not quite a bark, something lower and more concentrated, a compression of air through his chest that Caleb had learned over 3 years to treat as primary data. "What is it?" The dog pressed both front paws against the dashboard, his entire body a single directed line toward the cabin. Caleb cut the engine, stepped out into the cold, and the wind hit him with the full bluntness of what the afternoon had become. He pulled his collar up, checked the flashlight on his belt, and started toward the cabin. He was 10 feet from the porch when Ranger, who had launched himself out of the truck the moment the door swung open, cut directly in front of him and launched himself up the porch steps, hitting the cabin door with both paws in a flat, urgent impact that rattled the frame. Caleb had seen the dog alert before at coyotes in the lower pasture, at the occasional stranger who came up the driveway without announcement once at a section of fence that turned out to have a rattlesnake coiled in the grass beneath it. None of those alerts had looked like this. This was not territorial. This was not warning. This was the dog communicating something that didn't have a clean category, a franticness that bypassed the usual hierarchies of canine behavior and went straight to something more fundamental. Easy. Caleb took the porch steps, put his hand on the door. The knob turned without resistance, unlocked. He pushed it open 2 feet and stopped. Helen Crane sent me to check the cabin. My name is Caleb Merritt. I'm coming in. The interior was dark and cold. Not the cold of a space that hadn't been heated yet. The cold of a space where the heat had been running and then stopped, where the residual warmth had already surrendered to the temperature outside. He could feel the difference. He pushed the door fully open and stepped in, and Ranger went past him in a low, fast movement, heading straight for the main room. He followed. She was in the far corner near the window that looked out toward the tree line positioned beside the cold fireplace, as though she had tried to get close to it and then stopped. She sat in a lightweight wheelchair, the kind designed for ease of transport rather than rough terrain, and the right rear wheel was bent at an angle that made the entire chair list to one side. She had pulled a thin decorative throw blanket, the kind cabins put out as aesthetic objects rather than functional ones, over her legs and lower torso, and she had her arms wrapped around her own chest beneath it. Her hair was blonde, pulled back in a way that had come mostly undone strands across her face. Her lips carried the particular grayish undertone that came before blue. She was shaking with the deep, involuntary violence of a body that had moved past discomfort into genuine metabolic crisis. She looked up when he came into the room, and the expression on her face was the one he recognized from people who had been alone in a bad situation long enough that the arrival of another human being took a moment to process as something other than another threat. "I'm not going to hurt you." He said it quietly, without inflection, the way he had learned to speak in situations where a wrong tone was the difference between someone cooperating and someone shutting down. "My name is Caleb. Helen Crane owns this cabin. She asked me to check on you." Ranger had stopped 3 feet from her. The dog's entire demeanor had shifted the urgent, aggressive energy of the drive, and the door was gone, replaced by something deliberate and soft. He stood very still, his head lowered slightly, and made a sound in his throat that was barely audible, a low, sustained note that was the canine equivalent of sitting beside someone in a hospital room. The woman's eyes tracked from Caleb to the dog, and something in her face changed. Not relaxation exactly, more like the recognition that she had arrived at the bottom of a situation she could not handle alone, and that the people who had just walked in were not going to make it worse. "My chair." Her voice was rough, dehydrated. "The wheel I tried to get to the fireplace, and it caught on the—" She stopped, drew a breath that was unsteady. "The wood was in the box by the hearth, but I couldn't get close enough. My hands—" She looked at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. "I can't feel my hands." Caleb crossed the room in 4 steps, knelt in front of her, and took both her hands in his. They were ice. Not cold ice, the kind of cold that meant the small capillaries had given up trying to keep up. He pressed his own hands around hers and held them, not gently, with firm, sustained pressure, the way you transferred body heat in the field when waiting for warming wasn't an option. "How long have you been in here without heat?" "I don't—" She shook her head. "The power went out. I don't know what time. I was trying to— I had my phone, but the battery—" "When did you arrive?" "Yesterday. 2 o'clock. He did the math without commenting on it. Somewhere between 16 and 18 hours in a cabin that had dropped below 40 degrees once the power failed, with compromised mobility, alone. "Is there anyone else? Anyone who was supposed to be here with you?" A pause that told him more than the answer did. "No, I came alone." He stood up, made a single assessment of the room, the distance to the door, the weight of her in the chair, the condition of the wheel, the temperature differential between here and outside, and arrived at a conclusion the way he arrived at most conclusions in the field, which was quickly and without ceremony. I'm going to carry you to my truck. It's warm, it's running. We're going to my place. It's 5 miles back on this road. You don't have to. The wheel on your chair is bent past usable. He was already moving behind her, assessing the chair's handles. This cabin has no generator, no wood stove, and the pipes are going to freeze before midnight. I'm not going to leave you here. She didn't argue. He understood that her body had already made the argument for her. When a person's core temperature dropped far enough, the body reassigned resources. The elaborate social machinery of pride and self-sufficiency got deprioritized in favor of the more basic negotiations of survival. She had reached the point where being carried by a stranger was less frightening than the alternative. He lifted her from the chair with both arms, one under her knees and one across her back. She was lighter than he expected, not unhealthy light, but the kind of weight that told him she was smaller than the layered clothing suggested. She made a small, involuntary sound at the movement, the kind that came from blood starting to shift in a body that had been still for too long, and then she was still in his arms. The thin blanket still wrapped around her lower half, her hands now pressed together between them for warmth. Ranger, the dog was already moving toward the door. Heel. He had left the truck running, and the cab was warm. He put her in the passenger seat, adjusting the recline slightly so she wasn't vertical against the cold window. Ranger jumped in behind and immediately pressed his flank against her side. Not instructed, not cued. Simply decided. Caleb went back for the wheelchair, folded it despite the bent wheel, and wedged it in the truck bed, and then drove. She didn't speak for the first half of the drive, which he understood. Her body was occupied. He kept the heat at maximum, and the fan speed high, the vents directed toward the passenger side. He watched her in his peripheral vision, the way he watched uncertain terrain, not obsessively, but with the steady background monitoring of a man who needed information and knew that passengers in her condition could shift direction quickly. Her shaking began to diminish around the 3-mile mark. Not gone, still present in her hands and in the set of her jaw, but the violent whole-body trembling had downgraded. He noted this without comment. Mara. Her voice was still rough, but more controlled. My name is Mara Voss. He nodded. Caleb Merritt. Ranger made a small sound from the back seat. She turned her head slightly toward the dog. He found me first. He usually does. She looked back out the windshield at the snow moving through the headlight beams. He drove. The tires found the familiar compression patterns of his own driveway, and then the main house came up through the trees, the porch light burning amber against the white, the way he always left it when he went out after dark. He carried her inside. The cabin hit both of them with the accumulated warmth of a space that had been properly heated all day. Wood stove, working steadily in the main room, the residual heat from the morning's cooking still present in the kitchen air. He set her on the sofa, which was wide and deep, and positioned directly opposite the wood stove, and went immediately to the fire, adding 3 large pieces of oak and working the damper to open the drawer. The heat increased visibly, the iron of the stove ticking as the metal expanded. Ranger sat beside the sofa with the focus of a sentry who had accepted a new assignment. In the kitchen, Caleb made coffee, not the careful, considered kind, but the fast kind, the kind you made when what mattered was the liquid being hot and present as quickly as possible. He brought her a mug, wrapped her hands around it, the way he had wrapped them in the cabin, holding them in place until her grip firmed. Drink it. She drank. He watched the color begin a slow return to her face, not pink, yet but the gray retreating her lips, losing the undertone that had concerned him. There's a bathroom through that door. He indicated the hallway. There are towels on the second shelf. Hot water runs about 40 seconds after you turn the tap. He went to the storage closet at the end of the main room and pulled out 2 wool blankets, heavy oatmeal colored, the kind that had been washed so many times they had the softness of something older and more essential than fabric. He set them on the arm of the sofa. Get out of the wet things when you can. Keep the blankets close. She was looking at the room. He knew what she was seeing because he knew the room, the functional shelves of reclaimed wood, the paperbacks with broken spines, the complete absence of anything decorative except a single photograph on the mantel. Sarah Younger laughing at something outside the frame, her hand raised against sunlight he couldn't see in the image. He had put the photo there the first week after the funeral, and had not moved it since. I need to know something. He turned back to her. Your chair is in the truck bed. The wheel is bent beyond what I can fix tonight. Can you manage with the bathroom if I rig something to hold on to? She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not offense, not exactly. Something more complicated, the look of a person who was accustomed to this category of question landing differently than he was delivering it, not as an obstacle to be managed, but as a logistical fact requiring a logistical answer. If there's something fixed to hold on to, yes. He went to the bathroom, spent 4 minutes attaching a length of heavy rope to the towel bar and the iron bracket on the wall beside the door, creating a line she could use at standing height. He tested it with his own weight. It held. He came back and told her it was ready, and then he went to the kitchen and began making something to eat because she had been in that cabin for the better part of a day, with no indication she'd had food, and because in his experience a warm body required fuel as surely as it required heat. She navigated the distance to the bathroom with her hands on the furniture edges, and the wall moving in a way that spoke of long practice, not graceful, not painless, but functional and completely unashamed. She was gone 11 minutes. When she came back, she had the wool blanket around her shoulders and her wet outer layer gone, and the color in her face had improved again. Soup, he said from the kitchen. Sit down. Ranger escorted her back to the sofa. She sat, pulled the second blanket over her legs, and wrapped both hands around the new mug he'd left on the side table. Steam rose from it. He brought the soup canned chicken broth with dried pasta and a handful of whatever was in the cabinet, nothing that required admiration. She ate it with the focused efficiency of someone whose body was making the decisions. He ate standing at the kitchen counter. The lights flickered once, twice, and then held. He looked at the window. The snow was coming sideways now, the wind hitting the north face of the house with audible force. He did the mental calculation of road conditions against time and arrived at what he already knew. The logging road back to Helen's cabin would be impassable before midnight, and the county road below it would follow by morning. We're snowed in. He said it the way he said most necessary things, as information rather than apology. The road won't be passable until the plows come through. That's 2 days minimum, more likely 3, depending on what tonight does. She absorbed this without visible panic, which he noted. She sat quietly for a moment with the soup, looking at the fire. Ranger had positioned himself on the rug directly in front of the wood stove, but with his head turned toward the sofa, his eyes open, watching her with the steady, undemanding attention that was his particular form of companionship. I'm sorry about your house. She meant the intrusion. I've had worse company. He collected the empty bowl and went back to the kitchen. Later, when she had fallen into the shallow, exhausted sleep of a body, finally warm enough to stop fighting, he turned the overhead light off and lit the 2 oil lamps on the side table, keeping the room in the amber low light that was easier on a person waking, disoriented, in an unfamiliar space. He checked the wood stove, added a piece to keep it through the first hours of night, and went to the storage closet again. He pulled out the other cot, the one he'd kept folded there since the year after Sarah, when he had gone through a period of sleeping in different rooms, trying to find one that wasn't saturated with her absence, and set it up near the front door. His rifle leaned against the wall in its usual position. Not a statement, just habit, and a habit that had kept him and people around him alive on 3 continents, and which he saw no reason to abandon because he was now in Wyoming rather than somewhere with a more obvious argument for it. He sat on the cot, unlaced his boots, and opened the book on the side table. Marcus Aurelius, the Hayes translation, a copy so worn the spine had separated, and he'd taped it twice. He read. Ranger, after a careful consideration of available options, did not return to his usual spot on the rug. He lay down on the floor beside the sofa, his back against the wood, his breathing slow and settling into the rhythm of the room. The storm pressed against the house from all directions. The walls answered with the deep, confident silence of something built by people who understood what they were building against. Caleb read. The dog slept. The woman on the sofa breathed in the particular way of someone who had been cold for too long and was finally incrementally becoming warm. He turned the page. He was up before 4, which was when he had always been up, a scheduling legacy of the Corps that his body had internalized past the point where he could renegotiate it. He fed the fire first the house had held through the night, the wood stove doing the work it was built to do. Then he fed Ranger, then he made coffee. The wind had shifted coming from the northwest now, which meant the storm had rotated through its first phase and was entering the second. He looked at the window and saw only white. Mara was still asleep. He made oatmeal, set a bowl on the small side table with a spoon and a glass of water, and went outside to assess the damage. The snow had come in earnest. The porch had accumulated 14 inches on the far side of the railing, and the path between the house and the woodshed had disappeared entirely under a drift that reached his hip at its deepest point. He took the shovel from the bracket beside the door and spent 40 minutes clearing a workable path, his breath coming in the steady white clouds, his shoulders finding the rhythm of the work. The cold was absolute, the kind that made his cheeks feel like leather and turned the moisture in his beard to frost. But it was a clean, honest cold, the kind that required only the right gear and the willingness to be in it. He filled both arms with wood from the shed and went back in, stamping his boots on the porch before entering. Mara was awake. She had found the oatmeal and was working through it with the spoon sitting upright on the sofa, with the blankets folded back over her legs, her back straight. Ranger had moved from the floor to the rug by the stove, but his head was turned toward her, tracking her movements. "The wind switched," she said. He went to the stove and loaded the wood. "Northwest, second phase." So the estimate was conservative. He stacked the remaining pieces in the box beside the hearth. "Probably, €6 ring." She ate. He hung his wet jacket on the hook by the door and poured himself a second cup of coffee. The house had the particular quality of a space occupied by two people who do not yet know each other well enough to fill silences, but have decided independently that the silence is preferable to the performance of filling it. He stood at the kitchen counter. She sat on the sofa. Ranger divided his attention between the fire and the room with an impartiality that seemed deliberate. At some point in the mid-morning, he didn't look at the clock. The light through the snow-covered windows had that flat, indeterminate quality that made time imprecise. He became aware that she had been watching him, not in a way that required acknowledgement. He had spent enough time in close quarters with people under stress to understand the difference between the watchfulness of evaluation and the watchfulness of something else. She was reading the room, reading the shelves, the tools, the photograph on the mantel, the arrangement of a life that had been assembled for a purpose and then continued by momentum. He was at the workbench near the back window, cleaning the carburetor of the smaller generator maintenance he had been putting off for 2 weeks. The work required attention, but not silence, and he was aware that she had set her empty bowl down and was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the photograph above the fireplace. Her name was Sarah. He didn't look up from the carburetor. He said it the way he said most things, because it was accurate and because the alternative was allowing her to wonder and wonder incorrectly. She was a geologist. We built this place together in the summers of 2019 and 2020. She passed in January of 2021. The room was quiet for a moment, only the fire and the wind outside. "I'm sorry." She said it without the reflexive social inflation that most people applied to the phrase. Just the two words level and meant. "Yeah." He set the carburetor part down, picked up a clean rag. She looked at the photograph a moment longer, and then she said something he hadn't expected. Not a condolence, not an inquiry. She said, "She looks like someone who knew exactly where she was." He looked up then, despite himself, looked at the photograph and then at the woman on the sofa who had just described Sarah with more precision in 9 words than most people managed in a full conversation. Sarah had always known exactly where she was, geographically, emotionally, professionally, in the specific architecture of any room she occupied. It was the thing he had loved most about her, and the thing he missed with the most physical consistency, the way her certainty had organized the space around her. He didn't answer, but he held on to the words the way you held on to something useful when you found it unexpectedly. That evening, the second day of the storm, he made soup from the pantry staples, and they ate at the kitchen table, which was the first time he had eaten at the table with another person since a dinner with Helen 2 Christmases ago. He noticed this without assigning it particular significance. He cleared the bowls after. She asked if she could look at one of the books from the shelf, and he told her to take whatever she wanted. Later, he was in the kitchen working on the chain for the smaller chainsaw, another maintenance item, the kind of work his hands did on autopilot, when he heard her voice from the main room, low and private, the tone of a person who believes they are alone. She was talking to Ranger. I don't know what I was expecting to prove. And a pause ranger's response, probably the soft head tilt he used when someone was speaking to him without a command embedded in it. I thought if I just had 3 days where no one needed to... Another pause. That sounds stupid when I say it out loud. Caleb's hands went still on the chain. He's not a bad person. She said it the way people said things they had rehearsed into uncertainty. He's just the way he helps. It always comes with the shape of a cage. A long silence. The fire shifted and settled. I've been trying to figure out if that's normal for 4 years. I'm starting to think that's not a question you need 4 years to answer. He went back to the chain, carefully, without any sound that would reach the main room. What he had heard was not his to have heard. He knew that, but it sat in him the way certain things sat, not as something to be addressed, but as something to be understood quietly, the way you understood weather. The woman on his sofa had driven 5 hours into the Wyoming backcountry in late October, in a rental car that had no business on an unpaved road in deteriorating weather, not because of oversight or poor planning, but because she had needed to be somewhere that a certain person could not easily reach her. She had needed 3 days of silence so complete and absolute that even the silence she could find in her ordinary life wasn't sufficient. He understood this with a completeness that required no elaboration. Ranger made a sound from the main room, not a response sound, something different. The low single note that the dog used when he had made a decision. There was the soft shift of the dog's weight on the floorboards and then quiet. Caleb came to the kitchen doorway and looked into the main room. Ranger had left the rug and crossed the room. He was standing beside the sofa level with her face, and he had pressed his broad silver head against her hand, not asking to be petted, not performing comfort, simply making contact with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had assessed the situation and determined that presence was the correct response. She had her hand in his ruff without seeming to have made a decision about it, her fingers pressed into the thick fur behind his ear. Her face turned slightly toward the window, and the solid white darkness beyond it carried the expression of someone who had just put down something heavy they had been carrying for a long time, without identifying it as a weight. Caleb leaned against the doorframe and watched this for a moment. Then he went back to the chain. The fire ran down steadily. The wind outside had found a new pitch in the eaves, not higher, but more sustained, the long note of a storm that had committed to its full duration. The house answered it the way it always answered, with the quiet, structural certainty of something built for exactly this. The third morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had not softened. It had simply reorganized the vertical assault of the first 2 days, shifting into something more horizontal, and sustained snow driving in long, unbroken sheets across the clearing and piling against the north face of the house, in drifts that had now reached the lower sill of the kitchen window. Caleb was outside by 5, working the path to the woodshed, with a methodical efficiency that left no room for anything except the physical problem in front of him. The cold had dropped another 8 degrees overnight. He could feel it in the particular way his knuckles stiffened around the shovel handle, the way each breath required a conscious, full expansion of the chest to pull in enough of the thin, frozen air. He was not thinking about the woman inside. He was thinking about the woodshed, the generator fuel level, the condition of the cattle in the lower pasture shelter he had reinforced in October. He was thinking about the functional list of a man who had learned to keep his attention on what could be acted upon. This was the discipline that had kept him operational in places considerably more dangerous than a Wyoming winter, and it was the same discipline that had kept him functional in the 14 months after Sarah, when the alternative to a list of actionable tasks was an interior landscape he had no safe way of navigating. He brought in 2 full armloads of oak and one of the denser pine pieces for the overnight burn. He checked the generator. He came back inside. Mara was awake. She had been awake for a while, he judged from the way the blankets were folded back, with a precision that suggested deliberate activity rather than recent rising. She had found her way to the kitchen. He registered the evidence of this in the coffee that was already made, the second mug set out on the counter, with a consideration so small and unremarkable that it almost wasn't a thing at all. Almost. He poured the coffee without comment and stood at the counter drinking it. Ranger was at the window, his forepaws on the sill, watching the storm, with the focused professional attention of an animal conducting a formal assessment. After a while, Mara moved from the sofa to the kitchen table, the transit managed with the practiced economy of someone who had long since stopped performing the difficulty of it for an audience. She sat with her coffee and looked at the snow building against the glass. The drift on the north side went up another foot overnight. He refilled his mug. 2 feet by tonight if the wind holds. Does it usually hold this long? Second phase can run 36 hours. Sometimes longer if it's feeding off the range. She nodded. She was not asking because she was frightened. She was asking the way an engineer asked building a model, populating it with accurate data. He had noticed this about her in the 2 days she had been in his house. She gathered information with the quiet, systematic patience of someone who had learned that understanding a situation precisely was the first and most important form of control available to her. He went to the storage area behind the kitchen and came back with the broken wheelchair. He had retrieved it from the truck bed the previous afternoon and had been looking at the bent wheels since turning the problem over in the way he turned mechanical problems. The aluminum frame was repairable with what he had. The wheel assembly was a different question. The spokes were bent past, straightening the rim distorted, but the frame itself, the footrests, the seat structure, those were workable. He set it on the floor near the workbench and began disassembling the damaged wheel housing. Mara watched him for a moment. He could see her in his peripheral vision, the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to speak. "You don't have to do that." He turned a bolt counter clockwise. "I know." She said nothing else. He worked. Ranger abandoned the window and came to sit beside the workbench, supervising with the dog's characteristic sense of professional involvement in any project Caleb undertook. The work took 90 minutes. What he produced was not the original wheel. The replacement he fabricated from a spare caster mechanism he kept in the parts bin, a length of steel rod and 2 hose clamps, was neither elegant nor light. But it rolled, it held weight, and it tracked straight. He set the repaired chair in front of her without announcement or expectation of response. She put her hands on the wheels and tested the roll. Pushed it forward 3 feet back, 2. Checked the tracking. Her face was composed, but something moved through it briefly. Not gratitude or not only that. Something older and less comfortable, the expression of a person recalibrating an assumption they hadn't known they were making. "It'll do." She said it evenly, but the words carried a weight she hadn't put there on purpose. He was already back at the workbench, returning tools to their places. After lunch, sandwiches efficient, not a meal that invited lingering, he told her he was going to clear the porch and the immediate perimeter, and that it would take the better part of an hour. He said it the way he said most things that required no response as information. But at the door with his jacket half-zipped, he paused. He looked at the porch, then back at the 3 steps between the main room floor and the door. He did the geometry of it. She was watching him from the sofa. He went back to the storage area. He came out with a measuring tape and knelt at the bottom step, measuring the rise and run, with the tape pressed flat against the wood. He wrote the numbers on the back of his hand with the carpenter's pencil from his shirt pocket. He went outside. Mara sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the sounds that came from the direction of the small workshop attached to the woodshed. The scrape of the barn door. A pause. Then the sound of a handsaw working through lumber, not frantic, not hurried, a patient and deliberate stroke that had a rhythm to it, the rhythm of a person who had done this long enough that the tool was an extension of intention rather than an instrument of effort. The saw was followed by the drill, and the drill by the careful, muffled sound of a hammer striking at a restrained velocity, as though the person holding it was conscious of disturbing something. She had overseen the construction of buildings. She knew the grammar of construction sounds. She knew what was being assembled from the acoustic evidence alone, and the knowledge of it sat in her chest like a coal, warm and slightly painful and impossible to look at directly. He came back inside carrying a raw plywood ramp, 2x4 supports at the base. The whole thing finished with a grip strip he'd cut from the ribbed rubber mat in the workshop. It was not beautiful. It was precisely the right width for the wheelchair, the slope calculated at a ratio that would allow her to navigate it independently. He fitted over the 3 steps and locked the base against the floor with 2 wedge blocks. He stood back and tested the surface with his boot heel. Then he stepped aside. She rolled the chair to the base of the ramp and went up. The wood took her weight without flex. The grip strip held the wheels. She rolled through the door and onto the porch and stopped. The air outside was brutal and clarifying. The wind had a directional force to it that pressed against the face and the chest and made the eyes water, but it was also the first air she had breathed that was not the interior of a building in 3 days, and the quality of it pine resin, frozen earth, the specific mineral sharpness of high-altitude snow was overwhelming in the way that simple things became overwhelming after deprivation. She sat with it. The mountains were invisible in the white, but they were there. She could feel them, the particular weight of large vertical geology pressing on the atmosphere. Caleb leaned against the porch railing with his arms crossed, looking out at the clearing. Not at her. Ranger sat between them with the diplomatic impartiality of someone who understood that both parties required the same thing, and that his role was to be adjacent to it rather than to broker it. She loved Winter. His voice was level, not performing, not offering. Just a fact that had come up the way certain things came up when you were standing in a place saturated with a specific person's memory. Not the romantic version of it, the actual thing, the work of it, the weight of it. She said Winter was honest. It didn't pretend to be something you could manage without preparation. Mara held the wheels of the chair without moving them. The snow blew across the porch in thin, scouring lines. My accident. She looked at her hands on the wheels. The version I've been telling for 2 years. I was driving home from a work event. Road conditions, black ice. That's what I've said. She stopped. Started again with the precision of someone choosing exactness over ease. I was leaving Brent's family's property in the middle of the night because he had spent 4 hours at dinner making decisions about my career in front of his mother and 2 of his partners without consulting me. As though I was a resource that had been allocated, not a person who had been invited. The wind moved through the porch eaves above them. I got in the car because I needed to be somewhere he wasn't. I was crying. I missed a turn I've driven 100 times. The ravine on the south side of his road is 40 feet deep at that point. She said the last sentence, the way you said a thing you had been holding at arm's length for a long time and had finally decided to set down. I've never said that out loud. Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the clearing the way he had looked at the mountains when he talked about Sarah. Not avoidance, the respect that some things deserved not to be met with direct eyes, because direct eyes sometimes pressed a person back into the safer, prepared version of the story. Telling the truth about how you got hurt doesn't mean you deserve to get hurt. He said it without inflection, not as comfort as correction. The way you corrected a navigation error, not with emotion, with accuracy. She sat with those words the way you sat with something structural, something that needed to bear weight before you knew if it held. They stayed on the porch until the cold made staying impractical. He went in first, held the door. She came down the ramp and through it. Ranger followed last shaking snow from his coat at the threshold. The afternoon moved through its hours with the new quality the porch had given it, not easier exactly, but with a pressure release that had been present since the first night, a compression between 2 people that had finally found an exhaust. He worked on equipment in the back room. She read at the kitchen table a worn paperback she had taken from the shelf. He had noticed it was the Wyoming history volume, not the philosophy or the repair manuals. He did not assign significance to the choice. He simply noticed it. It was late afternoon, the flat light from the windows, going from gray to the darker gray that preceded dark when the sound came. Not the wind, not the house, a different engine, the particular frequency of a turbine, thin and precise against the lower registers of the storm. Ranger's head came up from his spot on the rug before Caleb consciously registered what he was hearing. The dog was at the window in 2 movements, rigid, his ruff elevated a growl building in his chest that was categorically unlike the sounds he made for weather or wildlife. Caleb was at the window beside him in 4 seconds. The aircraft came in from the south, following the terrain contour, with the deliberate precision of a professional pilot who knew what he was doing. It was a Bell 429. He knew the silhouette had been near enough to that model in the field to recognize it by the rotor sound alone. Matte black finish, no visible markings at the distance. Its searchlight sweeping the clearing in a flat, methodical arc. It circled once unhurried the way something circled when it already knew where it was going and was simply confirming the coordinates. Then it descended the rotor wash, blasting a secondary blizzard across the clearing, the snow lifting and spiraling outward in a 30-foot radius as the skids settled into the packed surface. Caleb stepped back from the window. Mara had not moved from the table. She had the book closed under her hands, pressed flat, and she was looking at the door with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had not found in the time available a way to make it not matter. The pilot stayed with the aircraft. The passenger door slid open and a single figure stepped out, moving through the wind-blown snow with the composed confidence of a man who considered weather a logistical nuisance rather than a physical force. Dark overcoat charcoal, the kind of garment that communicated its cost without requiring a label. His shoes were completely wrong for the terrain leather city weight, the shoes of a man who had not packed for conditions, because conditions had never been his problem to manage. His hair was untouched by the wind, which meant product. He covered the distance from the aircraft to the porch with a long, deliberate stride. Caleb went to the door before the knock. He opened it and stood in the frame. The man looked at him with the rapid, practiced assessment of someone accustomed to categorizing people within the first 3 seconds of encountering them. Caleb watched him do it, watched him take in the flannel, the boots, the set of the jaw, the absence of anything that registered as a credential in the man's particular taxonomy of the world, and arrive at a conclusion that was visible in the micro-adjustment of his posture, a barely perceptible settling into a configuration that communicated the other person had been found manageable. Ranger was at Caleb's left knee, still, not making a sound. The dog's silence was more communicative than the growl had been. Brent Calloway. He extended his hand with the fluency of someone who had shaken 10,000 hands and treated it as a mild administrative task. I appreciate you looking after Mara. This must have been an inconvenience. Caleb shook the hand once. Come in out of the cold if you need to. Brent stepped inside, took in the room, the same rapid cataloging, faster this time. The shelves and the fire and the furniture all processed and filed under a heading Caleb couldn't quite read but recognized by its shape. His eyes found Mara at the kitchen table, and his expression shifted into something that was constructed to look like relief. There she is. He moved toward the table without waiting. You have no idea I've been half out of my mind. Mara's hand stayed flat on the closed book. How did you find me? The question landed with a precision that interrupted his momentum. He paused, recovered, offered a short explanation with the patient indulgence of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should have known better: the emergency satellite phone he had given her 2 years ago, the GPS protocol built into its firmware, his security team's 48-hour monitoring capability. He explained this without apparent consciousness of what it described, that he had given her a tool for emergencies that was simultaneously a permanent location beacon, and had told her about the emergency function without mentioning the tracking one. Caleb stood near the door and said nothing. He was aware of Ranger beside him, the dog having moved from his knee to a position that placed him precisely between Brent's current location and the kitchen table, which Brent either hadn't noticed or had decided not to acknowledge. You should have called me. Brent's voice had shifted fractionally, still smooth, but with an understructure, now the thing that had been there all along and was now beginning to show through the surface. You know what happens when you go off like this. People worry. I worry. And then I end up in a helicopter in the middle of a blizzard looking for you, which frankly, Mara, Brent, her voice was level. Not raised, not defensive. Level in the way a plumb line was level, not because it was trying to be, but because its nature didn't permit otherwise. I came here alone. That was my decision. Your decision. He repeated it the way people repeated things they found mildly absurd. He looked around the room again slowly this time, and then he looked at Caleb with an expression that was adjacent to courtesy and not quite arriving there. I hope she hasn't been too much trouble. With her condition, she's been no trouble. Caleb said it simply, the way you said things that were true and required no elaboration. Brent held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to Mara with the manner of a man who had just made a decision he considered final. Cole is waiting. We need to leave before the weather closes the corridor south. Get your things. Ranger took one step forward. Not charging, not posturing. One measured step, repositioning himself closer to the kitchen table, his body oriented in a way that would have required Brent to move through him to reach Mara. The dog made no sound. His eyes were fixed on Brent with the unblinking, assessing focus of something that had made its own determination about the situation and was implementing it without drama. Brent noticed the dog this time. He looked at Caleb. Would you mind? Caleb didn't move. He's fine where he is. A pause. The fire in the wood stove ticked in the silence. The wind hit the north face of the house with a sustained horizontal pressure that made the window glass flex slightly in its frame. Mara's chair moved. Not toward the door, she turned the wheels to bring herself to a full, straight-on position at the table, her hands coming off the book and going to the wheels, a repositioning that was entirely about posture, about the physical grammar of how a person chose to occupy a space when they were making a decision they intended to mean something. No, she said it without raising her voice, without the tremor of someone fighting to say a word they were afraid of. She said it the way you said a thing you had been carrying toward for a long time and had finally arrived at. I'm not going. The room reorganized itself around those three words. Brent stood very still for a moment. His face underwent a small controlled rearrangement, the performance of patience over something that was not patience. Then he turned and the register he used for Caleb dropped entirely, and what replaced it was the voice of a man who operated in a world where most problems had prices, and he had not yet named one that was beyond his means. She's had episodes since the accident. I don't know what she's told you, but she's not always her judgment, isn't always she needs consistent. She told me she needed to get warm. Caleb kept his voice at the same even temperature it had been at since the man stepped through the door. Which she did. That's the whole of it. Something moved through Brent's face. It was fast, and it was not the patient, polished thing he had been presenting. It was the version of him that existed behind the cashmere, and it was considerably less composed. He looked at Mara. He looked at Caleb. He did the calculation, the same rapid taxonomy, and arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive, which was at the specific compound of a man and a dog and a woman who had all three independently arrived at the same position and were not going to be moved from it by any instrument he currently had available. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man closing a meeting he intends to reopen at a more favorable time. He looked at Mara with an expression that was a promise and not a warm one. Then he turned, walked back through the door Caleb held open, and crossed the clearing to the helicopter. None of them moved until the aircraft was fully airborne, and the sound of the turbine had thinned to a thread and then dissolved into the wind. Caleb closed the door, turned the deadbolt. Ranger, who had held his position throughout now, crossed the room and put his head in Mara's lap. Not the delicate press of the previous nights, but a full, committed weight, the dog's whole head resting on her knees, eyes closing. She put her hand on him, and her chest rose and fell with a long, unsteady breath that had been held longer than any breath should be held. Caleb went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with his back to the room, looking at nothing. He was aware of his own pulse in a way that he was not usually aware of it, not racing, just present a reminded heartbeat. He had not spoken in Brent's defense. He had not explained Mara's situation, qualified her decision, offered context, or performed the social machinery of moderation that the situation might have called for in a different room with different people. He had simply stood in his own house beside his own dog and permitted a woman to make a decision that was hers to make. It had required nothing from him except the willingness not to manage it. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to the table without being asked. The evening that followed was quiet in a new way. Not the armored quiet of the first night, not the careful quiet of the second. This was the quiet of a space where something that had been pressing had gone out of it, and the room was adjusting to its own dimensions. He made dinner soup again, the pantry running toward its simpler options. They ate at the table. Ranger was between them on the floor, occupying the geography between the 2 chairs with the benign authority of a dog who understood his own importance to the room's equilibrium. She asked about Sarah's work, and he told her the geologic surveys Sarah had done in the winds, the way she had described formations as though they were characters in a story with a very long timeline, the specific paper she had published in 2018 about alluvial deposit patterns in the upper tributaries that had apparently been cited enough times to make her quietly proud in the way she was quiet about most things that mattered to her. He did not perform these memories. He delivered them in the flat, accurate voice of a man reporting what he remembered, and they landed that way as true things, unembellished with the specific weight that true things have when they are not trying to be more than themselves. Mara told him about a building she had designed in her 3rd year, a small public library in a rural county in the eastern part of the state. Her first commission, underfunded, full of structural constraints that had required her to problem solve at a level she hadn't been asked to reach before. She had spent 2 extra months on the accessibility design, working it past the ADA minimum requirements into something that was genuinely functionally generous. It had won nothing. It had been too small to be noticed by anyone who noticed buildings. But the county librarian had sent her a photograph the following spring of a woman in a motorized wheelchair reading in the window seat Mara had designed specifically for the southern light. She kept the photograph in her studio. He listened without filling the spaces between her sentences. This was, he had been told by the one therapist he had seen in the first year after Sarah, 2 sessions insufficiently useful to continue a quality he possessed that was unusual enough to mention. He had not known at the time whether it was a quality or simply the absence of the impulse to perform attentiveness. He still didn't know. But he had observed that people sometimes said things in his presence that they appeared to have been waiting to say for a long time, and he suspected the listening had something to do with it. Later past 10, with the fire rebuilt for the night and the lamps turned to low, he went to his cot by the door with his book. He read 4 pages and then became aware of a sound from the main room that was not the fire and not the wind and not Ranger's breathing. He set the book down. The sound was intermittent, barely audible, the specific compression of sound that a person made when they were trying to cry without making noise. He had heard it before in the specific geography of hospitals and in the compressed quarters of forward operating positions and in his own house in the first months of 2021, when he had sat in the dark kitchen after midnight and allowed himself what the daylight hours wouldn't permit. He did not get up. He did not speak. He was aware that this was a moment that required nothing from him except the continued presence of warmth and shelter, and the implicit understanding that whatever was happening on the sofa in the next room was permitted to happen without intervention. Ranger's claws on the floor, a soft, deliberate sequence. The dog had gotten up from his spot and was moving toward the sofa. There was the familiar particular sound of the dog settling his weight against the wooden frame of it close to her, and then the shift of his breathing as he resettled and went still. Caleb lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the storm working against the walls of the house his wife had loved. He thought about what Mara had said on the porch, not the specifics but the shape of it, the structure of a life in which a person had arranged themselves so carefully around someone else's will that they had lost track of what their own will felt like until they ran it off a road in the dark, trying to get away from a dinner table. He thought about the 30-day letter on the kitchen table, which he had not thought about in 2 days, which was the longest he had gone without thinking about it since it arrived. He thought about Sarah saying in the 3rd month after her diagnosis, in the particular voice she used for things she had decided were important enough to say once, and clearly, "The land doesn't need you to stay here, Caleb. I need you to not disappear after." He had told her he didn't know how to promise that. She had said that was fine, that she wasn't asking for a promise, she was asking him to know it was an option. He had not thought about that conversation in 2 years. He turned onto his side facing the wall. Outside, the wind ran its long, cold hand across the roof of the house and found, as it always found, that the house was not moving. The second phase of the storm ended at some point in the pre-dawn hours. He knew it the way he knew most things that happened while he was awake in the dark. By the change in the quality of the sound, the wind dropping from its sustained horizontal assault to something more intermittent, more vertical, the specific acoustic signature of a system that had passed its peak and was beginning the long process of exhausting itself. He was fully awake when the sound happened. Not the wind. The wind had been renegotiating its contract with the house all night. This was interior, a soft scraping movement from the direction of the kitchen, the specific acoustic weight of bare feet on cold wood, followed by the clean glass-on-counter sound of someone setting a cup down. He had cataloged the acoustic profile of this house over 11 years. He knew every sound it made. This was a new one. He moved from the cot without sound, the flashlight already in his hand. He did not turn it on immediately. He crossed the main room in the dark, reading the floor's geography through the soles of his feet, the way he had learned to read terrain in places where light was a liability. He moved through the kitchen doorway and put his thumb on the flashlight switch. The beam came on and found her. She was standing at the counter, both feet flat on the kitchen floor, her left hand resting on the counter, surface at hip height, not gripping, just resting a light point of contact. Her right hand held the glass of water she had just filled, and she was drinking it with her back to him, looking out the kitchen window at the darkness beyond the glass. She was standing the way people stood in their own kitchens at 3 in the morning, with the unremarkable ease of someone who needed water and got up to get it. The flashlight beam held on her and did not waver. He understood immediately what he was seeing, and the understanding went through him with a speed and a heat that was entirely physical, bypassing the deliberate measured cognition he had trained himself to rely on. The chair he had repaired. The ramp he had measured and built in the cold, his hands stiffening around the saw handle. The careful rope line in the bathroom. The calculation he had made and remade about how to make the space navigable for a person who could not stand. She heard the beam hit the room. He watched her body register it, the slight shift of her shoulders, the stillness that followed the particular held quality of someone who had just understood that a thing they had not prepared for had arrived. She turned. Her face in the flashlight beam carried the full, unguarded impact of being caught. Not by guilt, the expression was more complex than guilt and less clean. It was the face of someone for whom the distance between the seen truth and the spoken truth had just collapsed without warning, and who was standing in the rubble of that collapse in front of a man who had built a ramp for her in the cold. Caleb. She said his name the way people said names when they were trying to locate something solid to hold on to. He lowered the flashlight until the beam was on the floor between them. He stood in the kitchen doorway for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 15 seconds, looking at her without the beam on her face. Then he turned the light off. The kitchen went dark. From the main room, a soft sound. Ranger waking to the tension in the house, a single questioning note, and then the click of the dog rising and moving toward the kitchen, and then stopping at the threshold, looking between them in the dark with the profound, patient uncertainty of something that understood that a thing had broken and did not yet know which of its people needed it more. The morning after the flashlight came without ceremony. The wind had dropped overnight from its sustained assault to something intermittent, the storm cycling down through its final phase, and by first light the snow was falling straight and slow, vertical patient, the kind that meant the system had exhausted its worst and was finishing what it started. Caleb was at the wood stove before the light changed, adding fuel with the same hands that had held the flashlight 6 hours earlier. But the house felt different in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He had not slept after the kitchen. He had gone back to the cot and lain on his back in the dark and let the anger move through him, the way he let difficult things move, not feeding it, not fighting it, just permitting its transit. He had learned this in a convoy outside Fallujah in 2007 and confirmed it in a hospital waiting room in Casper. In 2020, the anger that wasn't examined became the anger that made decisions, and the decisions it made were rarely right. By 3 in the morning, he had reached the far edge of it and found something more complicated waiting there. Not forgiveness, that word was too clean for what it actually was. More like the uncomfortable suspension of a verdict he had delivered before the evidence was complete. He made coffee. He stood at the counter and did not look at the bank letter. Outside, the snow fell in the silence of a storm that had made its point and was now simply finishing. Mara was awake when he heard the wheelchair on the floor, the sound of someone who had been lying in the dark for hours, and decided that lying there further served no purpose. She came through the kitchen doorway and stopped across the table from him and looked at the coffee and then at him, and her face carried the directness of someone who had spent the night deciding not to approach this sideways. "Sit down." She said it before he could arrange the first sentence of what he had been building since midnight. Not a demand more, the authority of someone who had decided the conversation was happening on honest terms or not at all. It landed with enough weight that he pulled out the chair and sat. She put both hands flat on the table. Not clasped, not fidgeting. Flat the way a person established a foundation before building on it. She told him the medical facts the way she would have presented specifications to a structural engineer. The accident in 2023 had damaged the L3 and L4 vertebrae, compressing the spinal cord without severing it. Incomplete paraplegia. Her lower body retained partial motor function. She could bear weight briefly against a fixed point of support, could stand for intervals under 30 seconds. With something solid to brace against, could shift and pivot with assistance. She could not walk. She could not stand on irregular or unstable terrain, could not stand without a fixed contact point, could not sustain the position long enough for it to be functional independence. What he had seen in the kitchen at 3 in the morning was the full extent of what her body could do, not concealed evidence of something more. The difference between the kitchen counter and the ground between a truck and a cabin door in a foot of drifted snow was not performance. It was physics. She said all of this looking at him directly, And when she finished, she picked up the coffee he pushed toward her and drank it and did not add anything to what she had already said. He sat with it. He ran it against what he had seen in the kitchen and found that it held consistent, verifiable, the kind of account that didn't require belief, so much as the willingness to follow the logic where it went. He had been wrong. He had seen a partial thing through a flashlight beam and assembled a complete story around it before he had enough evidence to justify the conclusion. He had done it because he was primed 4 years of managed isolation, the bank letter, the helicopter, all of it conspiring to make betrayal the most available interpretation of anything ambiguous. He had fired at a shape in the dark and missed. He stood up. He went to the door and outside. He did not reach for the shovel. He sat on the top porch step, in the cold, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them, and looked at the clearing where the snow was still coming down in slow vertical lines. Ranger came through the unlatched door and pressed against his left side, warm and immediate. Neither of them spoke, which was the only register available for what was happening. He thought about the 30-day letter. 18 days ago. 12 days remaining. He thought about 3 years of payments. He couldn't sustain money moving from his account into a mortgage that had been underwater before Sarah's medical bills arrived, a structure he had been maintaining, not because he believed it was viable, but because the act of maintaining it was the last available relationship he had with the place. He had been holding the land in lieu of holding on to her, and the land was slipping anyway, and he had known it for 2 years, and continued because stopping meant admitting that what he was actually doing was standing still inside the perimeter of a life that had ended and calling it loyalty. Sarah had not asked him to keep the land. She had told him not to disappear. He had kept the land. He had disappeared anyway, just within the fence lines. He sat with this. At some point, the weight of it, not the cold, not the bank, but the exhaustion of a man who had been arguing with a fixed position for 3 years, released the way a rope releases when you stop pulling against it. Not resolution, not happiness. Just the cessation of an effort he had not realized was constant until it stopped. He went back inside. Mara was still at the table, coffee in her hands. She looked up when he came in, and he sat down across from her and said with the directness he reserved for things that needed saying once and accurately, "I owe you an apology. I built a conclusion out of a flashlight beam in 3 seconds, and I was wrong. I'm not going to dress it up." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "You're the first person who's apologized to me for something they got wrong instead of something I got wrong." Not bitter delivered as a data point, she was still integrating a fact about her recent years that she hadn't fully examined until it came out of her mouth just now. He didn't know what to do with that except leave it where it landed, which was what it deserved. He went to work. The generator, the weather stripping on the back window, the pipe insulation compressing wrong under the sink. He worked steadily through the morning, and the house moved through its hours with a new quality, not easier exactly, but with a pressure gone that had been present since the first night, something between the walls that had been compressed and was now simply air again. In the early afternoon, the sun came out, low and pale without real warmth, but it changed the clearing. The drifts going from flat white to a landscape with shadow and depth, the tree line resolving back into its actual dimensions, the mountains returning layer by layer from the cloud cover. Each ridge arriving like a confirmation that the permanent things had been there the whole time, simply obscured. She asked to go back to the porch. He held the door, and she went up the ramp and out, and they stood in the cold without the obligation of conversation while the mountains finished arriving. Ranger sat between them and tilted his face into the post-storm air. After a while, she said, "I'm going to end it with Brent." She said it the way someone stated a decision already made, speaking it aloud to hear how it sounded in open air, rather than in the enclosed space of the mind where it had been forming. "I've known for a long time. I kept finding reasons why the timing was wrong. Mostly I was waiting until it stopped feeling like I was losing something." She looked at the mountains. "It doesn't feel like that anymore. It feels like putting down something I've been carrying in the wrong configuration for so long I forgot what my own posture was supposed to be." Caleb looked at the same ridgeline he had looked at when he talked about Sarah. Staying somewhere isn't the same as being somewhere. I spent 3 years learning that the hard way. The sun moved through the clouds and came out direct for about 30 seconds, turning the snow in the clearing from white to hammered gold. Then it was gone. Neither of them remarked on it. It had been its own complete thing. The next day, the county plow worked its way up from town. He heard it in the morning at the lower elevation, and by early afternoon, the logging road was navigable. He confirmed it by driving to the county road junction and back. Rough and compacted, requiring care but passable, he told her. She nodded and began organizing herself with the efficiency of someone who had reduced departure to its necessary components. He retrieved the repaired wheelchair from the workshop. He pulled the rental car out of the drainage ditch with the tow chain, jumped the battery, let the engine run 15 minutes. He held the passenger door of his truck. Ranger was in the back before the seating arrangement could be determined. At Helen's cabin, he transferred her to the rental. She sat with the engine running and the window down and the cold coming in. "Thank you, Caleb." She said his name the way she had said it in the dark kitchen. But what was in it now was entirely different, not grasping for something solid, but the sound of a person who had found solid ground and was acknowledging where she found it. He nodded once. She drove south and disappeared below the ridge. He drove back up to the ranch. The house was quieter in the way of a space that had held more than usual, and returned to its baseline. Not empty, he had learned the difference between empty and quiet in the months after Sarah, and this was quiet. He fed Ranger. He made dinner. He ate at the table instead of standing at the counter, which was a small thing and was not a small thing. The bank letter was still there. 12 days had become 11. He picked it up and read it again, then went to the filing cabinet and pulled out the full folder, the complete record of 3 years of falling behind the interest statements and past due notices and the original loan document from 2019, and spread it on the table and looked at it with the attention of a man who had finally decided to understand something instead of manage it from a distance. The numbers were what they had always been, but his relationship to them had changed the way relationships to facts change when you stop arguing and start working. He sat with the documents for 2 hours. He did not solve anything. He did understand it completely without the defensive crouch he had been maintaining, and understanding it was the precondition he had been refusing to meet for 3 years. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. 4 weeks after Mara's rental car went south below the ridge, a letter arrived from the bank in the envelope format he associated with finality. He was at the table with coffee and Ranger at his feet when he opened it, reading with the braced attention of a man who had been receiving bad news in these envelopes long enough that the bracing was automatic. The language was institutional and impersonal. The outstanding mortgage had been satisfied in full. Payment received and processed. Zero balance. The pair of record, Voss Architecture, LLC. He set the letter down. He sat without moving while the fire worked through its cycle, and Ranger's breathing stayed even against his boot. He let the anger arrive because it was going to arrive, regardless the hot anger of a man whose pride was the last thing he had maintained at full strength when everything else was in arrears. The anger that said he had been managed reduced, converted into a project that someone with a checkbook had decided to resolve. He sat with it for 20 minutes. He did not move from the chair. He did not let it touch anything. Then he read the letter again, and this time he read it differently. She had not sent him money. She had not written a check, had not created a transaction that carried the structure of debt or obligation, or the power differential of one person's generosity aimed at another person's insufficiency. She had made a payment to a bank on behalf of a piece of land to remove a mechanism positioned to take something from him that could not be replaced. She had not asked him. She had not warned him. She had not attached an explanation or a request for acknowledgement. She had simply removed an obstacle the way you removed an obstacle when you had the means, and the obstacle stood between someone you respected and the ground they were supposed to be standing on. He thought about what she had said on the porch about the library, the woman in the motorized wheelchair reading in the window seat, the photograph kept in the studio, the 2 extra months on accessibility design that no one would ever specifically credit. He thought about a woman who had told him the true version of her accident, not the managed version that had been living in the world for 2 years, but the version with a dinner table in it, and a man who spoke about her career in front of his family as though she were a resource that had been allocated in a dark road in a ravine 40 feet deep. He thought about what it had cost her to say that to a man she had known 3 days in the cold, without any certainty about how it would land. He thought about the ramp still in the doorway. He put on his jacket and drove to Helen's. Helen opened the door before he knocked, which was her way, and she looked at his face with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who had been reading what people actually meant for 65 years and rarely needed them to explain it. He told her about the letter. She made tea he hadn't asked for and sat across from him and let him finish without filling the spaces. She doesn't want you to contact her. Helen held her mug with both hands. She was clear about that when she called. She called you from the road. She did. Said she needed you to know the land was the point, not you. Her words. Helen looked at him steadily. She also asked me something before she got off the phone. He waited. She asked what color toys Ranger liked. He sat with the weight of this. A woman who had just arranged the satisfaction of a significant financial instrument had thought in the same conversation to ask about the preferences of a dog. Not as a gesture toward him, as a gesture toward the dog because the dog had earned it on its own terms, and she was a person who understood that some debts were owed to creatures who would never understand the currency, but would understand the thing itself completely. He drove home. On the porch, set squarely against the front door where a delivery driver had left it, was a cardboard box with no return address, dense, heavier than its size weight, distributed in a single solid mass. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, cut the tape. Inside, nested in brown packing paper, was a rubber ball. Large, the kind engineered for dogs with the jaw strength to prove a point about durability. It was red, not the generic red of mass production, but a specific saturated red. The red of something chosen deliberately. The red of an object meant to be visible in snow. There was no note. Ranger had his nose in the box before Caleb had registered what he was looking at, and when the ball came free, when the dog's teeth closed around it, and the rubber held without yielding a sound came from him, unlike his usual bark or alert or questioning whine. It was a sound of sheer recognition, an animal encountering the thing that the concept of a thing had always been pointing toward. He ran, not the controlled trot of a dog moving with purpose, but the full, uninhibited sprint of an animal in possession of something it intended to keep, his claws finding the wood floors, his body taking the corners of the main room with the loose-limbed joy of a creature that had temporarily set down everything except velocity. He ran one circuit, came back, dropped the ball at Caleb's feet, backed up and looked up with the full argument of his entire body assembled into a single, unambiguous expression. Caleb picked up the ball, solid in his hand, warm from the dog's mouth, the rubber surface ridged for grip. He stood in the hallway of the house he had built with his wife and looked at this object a woman had ordered, shipped to an address she had gotten from Helen in a box with no note, because no note was needed for a dog who had made his own decision about her, independent of anything either of the humans in the room had decided. He threw it. The ball hit the far wall and came back at an angle, and Ranger was on it before it stopped moving. He came back in 4 seconds and dropped it again, his tail moving with the conviction of an animal who had just established a new permanent feature of the daily order. Caleb threw it again. On the third throw, a sound came out of him that he was not prepared for, short, low, rusty from long disuse, a muscle group that had been in suspension long enough that its re-engagement was slightly surprising. He threw it a 4th time, and the sound came again, less rusty, more itself. He stood in his own hallway throwing a red rubber ball for his dog, and heard himself make the sound of a man who still had the capacity for uncomplicated moments. And the discovery of this was both smaller and larger than anything he would have known how to predict. He had not heard that sound from himself since before Sarah's diagnosis. The December that followed was clear and cold and purposeful. Caleb worked the ranch with the steady rhythm of a man who had finally looked at his finances with clear eyes and was making actual decisions rather than deferring them. He called a financial advisor in Pinedale, a conversation he had been avoiding for 2 years, and began understanding what was available to him now that the mortgage was gone. The options were not unlimited. They were real, which was better than the alternative he had been living inside. He threw the ball for Ranger in the mornings. He ate at the table. He read in the evenings with the oil lamp rather than the overhead light, which was a preference he had suppressed for 3 years because it had been Sarah's preference first. He did not contact Mara. He understood why she had asked him not to, understood it as the thing being protected, not their connection, but her process. The space she needed to make the decision she had said she was going to make, without the complication of a concurrent conversation blurring its edges. Some decisions needed to be made in clean air. He had moved to Wyoming specifically for clean air. He understood the requirement. He thought about her because choosing not to think about someone required an active effort that confirmed the presence of the thing being managed, and he had always preferred honesty to management. He thought about the precision she had brought to the porch conversation, the absence of performance in either direction, the way the true version of the accident had come out with the same structural clarity she apparently applied to buildings. He thought about a woman who had spent 2 years with the wrong version of a true story and had told him the right one because something about the air on that porch made the wrong version feel structurally unsound. Whether she had done it, whether the decision that sounded so settled had held in the environment where Brent was not an intrusion, but a constant, was not his to resolve. He let it be. He threw the ball. He waited the way you waited for weather, not passively, but without the illusion that waiting harder changed anything. On a Tuesday morning in the third week of December, he was at the east fence line retensioning wire that the snow load had slackened, working along the post with the come-along and the staple gun. Ranger ranged in the field behind him, running wide arcs with the red ball gripped in his jaw, periodically returning to offer it and departing again when no throw was immediately forthcoming. The engine sound arrived before the vehicle. Not his truck, not the delivery van that came twice a month, not anything he had cataloged in 11 years on this property. Older, maintained rather than new, a working engine, not a commuting one. He straightened from the fence post and turned toward the driveway. A truck came through the gap in the tree line. Blue, the kind of blue that had weathered from something more deliberate into the color of the winter sky on a clear afternoon. It moved at the pace of someone who knew the destination and had already decided on the arrival, not fast, not hesitant, committed. It stopped 20 yards from where he stood. Ranger stopped his arc. He turned toward the truck with his full attention, deployed the red ball forgotten in his grip, his body running the instantaneous calculation that dogs ran when variables changed. He held for 2 full seconds. Then the rigidity went out of him, completely replaced by the total mobilization of an animal that had identified something it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. He dropped the red ball in the snow without looking at it. He ran. The driver's door opened, and she stepped out, her crutch under her left arm, her right hand on the doorframe for the initial weight shift, and then she was clear of the truck and standing on the packed snow of the driveway. Ranger reached her at full speed and performed the thing that large dogs sometimes performed, of pulling 75 pounds of momentum back from the edge of impact at the last possible instant, his paws going to her shoulders with a force that was somehow also gentleness, his face going to her neck, a sound coming from him that had no clean category, not a bark, not a whine. Something closer to a declaration that had been building for 7 weeks and was now finally reaching its intended recipient. She wrapped her arm around him and pressed her face into his coat and held on, and the sound she made against his neck was not words and did not need to be. Caleb walked across the field toward them. Not urgently, not slowly. The pace of a man moving towards something he had decided about. The snow under his boots was packed hard, the kind that had been through the worst of the season and was now simply itself. Ranger came down off her shoulders and began moving around her in the tight circuits of a dog whose happiness had exceeded the capacity of any stationary position. He ran 1 circle, came back, pressed his nose into her hand, ran another, then remembered the red ball and ran back to where he had dropped it in the snow, snatched it up, and brought it to her and set it at her feet. He backed up 2 steps and looked at her with an expression that contained an entire argument in a single glance. She bent and picked it up, slowly, with the real effort of what her body actually was, without performance in either direction. She threw it with a low arc that sent it bounding across the field, and Ranger was gone before it landed his legs, finding full extension, his coat catching the thin winter light. Caleb stopped a few feet from her. She looked at him with the directness she had arrived with, no rehearsal, no managed approach. Just the face of someone who had driven to a specific place because it was where she needed to be, and had not spent the miles preparing a speech about it. She wore a dark green wool coat, and her hair was down, and the cold had its usual honesty about her face. She looked like what she was, a woman who had made a decision and was standing in it. He looked at her and at the field and at his dog bounding back across the snow with the red ball and at the mountains behind the tree line in the December light. In his chest, the weight that had been structural for so long it had become invisible made its absence known not dramatically, but the way a sound you've stopped hearing announces itself only in its cessation. There and then, not there. And the difference between those two states was the whole of it. He said the only thing that was accurate, "Coffee's on." He nodded toward the house. Her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that the distinction didn't matter. "I was counting on that." He turned toward the house. She fell in beside him, her crutch finding the packed snow with the practiced sureness of someone who had learned the specific language of winter terrain, and Ranger came in from the field and positioned himself between them with the satisfied authority of a dog who had never had any doubt about how this was going to resolve. The porch ramp was where it had always been. He had not moved it. Some mornings he had looked at it and understood that leaving it in place was itself a position, and he had been willing to hold that position without knowing what it was a position toward. Now he knew. He held the door. She went through. Ranger went through. Caleb stepped in after them and pulled the door closed on the cold and the field and the long season that had done what long seasons did, insisted on itself until it was finished, then left the landscape changed in ways that only became visible when you stopped looking for what used to be there. The house settled around the three of them the way it settled around everything it was asked to hold, without comment, without condition, with the structural confidence of something built by people who understood that the point of walls was not to keep things out, but to give what mattered somewhere to stay. Outside in the field where Ranger had dropped it and forgotten it, the red ball sat in the snow, vivid against the white, the color of something chosen on purpose. Proof of a kind of attention that did not require the witness of the recipient, the kind that arrived in a box with no note, because the thing itself was the note, and the note said, "I knew you. I paid attention. I remembered what mattered to you even when you weren't there to know I was remembering." The kind that kept.